So obviously you can get like essays on how successful was the prime minister in general. So you could look at her international policies, economic, social. We'll look at economic because you can get one specifically on economic and one specifically on social for each prime minister as well. So we'll look at Thatcher's economic, we'll look at Thatcher's social, and we'll look at her industrial relations. And then obviously if you get an essay on how successful was Thatcher, just in general, you can just combine these three
Yeah.
essays together, and that kind of takes care of that. But let's look at her economic policies first. So obviously this is what she's most famous for. Like when people think of Thatcher and her successes, people think of the economic success. So we can analyze it on three different areas: on taxation, on economic policy, and on privatization. Again, you can break it into whatever factors you want, but in these essays, you need three factors more or less, or two if you're running out of time. So in terms of taxation, we'll look at where did it have a success or a mix of the two of them. Um, so it eventually had a positive effect on inflation, her taxation policies, because she changed the where she was going to tax. So she shifted it from a direct tax, from income tax, capital gains tax, inheritance tax. She reduced those and increased the tax on VAT. The idea behind this being that, of course, you can avoid paying tax on income. It's quite hard to avoid paying VAT. And it becomes a direct tax on consumption. So in terms of her policy, she believes obviously
Yeah.
those who are hardworking and save shouldn't
Yeah.
really be penalized, but those who spend loads should. And in that case, this taxation policy makes sense because those spending a lot will be basically paying it via VAT. So that's
On the
a
other, that's
yeah,
one argument. And if a more left-wing argument would be that it unfairly penalizes the poor, right? Because
yeah,
everyone's buying food and
yeah,
groceries and all of that and paying the same tax on those goods, but
yeah,
with different means to afford them.
yeah, yeah,
Mm.
and like inflation initially worsens from this, although eventually inflation, her new economic policies kind of transform this to get the economy back under control. I suppose I should give a general overview of her economic ideas as well, compared to the post-war consensus. So, of course, post-war consensus is for nationalization, and she changes that and decides that the bigger country is going to go for privatization rather than nationalization. So she takes that.
So yeah. So could you say if you really just wanted to sum it up in a sentence, you could say the post-war consensus is really a more social, it's more social economic socialism, right?
Yeah,
Socialist policies, whereas Thatcher is free market economics.
yeah,
And she manages to the consensus on a more I wouldn't say it's not completely socialist, but relatively speaking, more socialist policy. Thatcher manages to break that consensus across the parties, right?
yeah,
Through
yeah.
taxation policies,
I wouldn't
economic
say she
policy.
breaks it across the parties initially, but certainly when by Blair. You know what I mean? Labour don't
Yes,
win. Put it this way, Labour don't win trying to go back to the old way of doing things. So it's only
yes,
Blair kind of accepts this new Thatcherite economics that Labour win in 97,
right,
which we'll look at.
right.
But yeah, so like,
Because the problem with the Keynesian economics is
yeah,
that it leads to, well, arguably, I mean, this is a huge debate, but arguably leads to inflation, right, and to economic stagnation.
yeah, like what
So
the general consensus is and what they realize is that it leads it most, I mean, certainly in the British case, it led to inflation. And then the problem is the way to get out of slumps in Keynesian economics is to spend, and the government spending leads to further inflation. You can almost see
exactly,
that
right.
with,
So it's a vicious cycle.
yeah, you see that in America with Biden's flooding the market after COVID. That's
Exactly.
inflation.
Yeah. No, we still see this. I mean, this problem, this is still a very, very lively debate today.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I don't think anyone really understands the economy. It's far too big for any one person to understand. So I think even economists
but
just,
there are strictly speaking, I mean, I think this is on the right side of politics, there is definitely a disagreement among those who are more protectionist.
mm,
For example, Trump's tariffs,
yeah,
represents in fact a more protectionist um, attitude to economics, and there are more free market economic attitudes.
Yeah,
So obviously Thatcher is definitely on on the free market
yeah. I
side.
mean, you could argue Thatcher's more free market economics than any American president that's ever existed, because the Americans talk free markets but don't really do it. They've always been more
Yeah,
protectionist.
right. Well, I mean, Reagan is the counterpart, isn't he, to
Yeah,
Thatcher?
yeah.
But there are ironies. Well, we're not going to talk about Reagan
No,
particularly,
no.
but okay. So anyway, I guess to continue on.
Yeah.
So
So
this is
she
what it
goes
needs to
from
challenge the Keynesian
yeah.
post-war consensus.
Yeah, so like the Keynesian post-war consensus of like Keynesian economics is replaced by monetarism as a main economic system. So she changes that model. The high taxes, high spending model she changes, transforms it to a lower taxation, lower spending model. Um, like I said, she changes nationalization for privatization. She doesn't,
Yes.
she changes the consensus that trade unions have the right to exist to breaking them.
So
The only
sure,
one she
just
doesn't
yeah.
touch, wait, the only plank she
Mm.
doesn't touch in the post-war consensus is the concept of the welfare state. So she never ever challenges the fundamental concept that the welfare state should exist, which was an Attlee thing.
Right.
She just decides that it should be smaller and more efficient. But like she never actually she challenges completely the actual fundamental plank, the other three planks of post-war consensus, but not that one. She never actually goes to abolish the welfare state, just to reduce it.
She does affect it. I mean, even the NHS
Yeah.
policy, she introduces changes, doesn't she? In
Yeah, but
terms
she
of the
doesn't want
way
to get
that
rid of it.
hospitals are managed. No, no,
No.
of course not.
That's what I mean. But yeah, but the other three, she literally wants to get rid of the other
Yes.
flanks of the post-war consensus. But even she is like, I'm not going to remove that one. Um,
Yes, right. And so just to explain those points. Okay, so maybe we're jumping ahead to privatization.
that's all right. You can jump
So
around. We'll jump around and then we'll come back onto it.
so I guess it's important to understand what privatization means and what are the
Yeah.
arguments for doing it, right?
Mhm.
I guess the big one is that um, it makes the whether it's the education sector or whether it's industry or telecommunications, for example, it makes it more efficient if they're running like private businesses, right? There's
Yeah.
more competition, there's more investment. Whereas when it's run
In
by government,
theory,
when it's in theory, okay. So I'm trying to
yeah,
lay
that's their
out
justification. Yeah.
the kind of everyman basic understanding of what it means, right?
Hmm.
The basic argument. Because if it's run by the government, you reduce all the you get perverse incentives, don't you? In theory.
I think you get
So
perverse
so
incentives
if
both
there's not a lot
ways.
of competition, if there's not a lot of competition, you get a lot of waste. You
Mm.
get too much bureaucracy. Not a lot of incentives to improve processes or to improve
But if you go privatization,
services. Mhm.
if you asset strip a company on privatization, put all your money into dividends to your shareholders and don't reinvest into the company, you have similar problems. So I think there are
Yeah,
issues with both.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So there are arguments on either side.
Yeah.
But Thatcher's certainly coming from the position that I sort of laid out badly, generally speaking.
Yeah. I
Correct?
yeah, you know me, I'm more of a centrist. I always believe there's a balance on both. I think the extremes are always problematic on both. Anything
Yeah.
taken to extreme is always a problem. I'm very much on the Chinese yin yang concept of that. Like everything taken to its extreme becomes its opposite, becomes a real problem.
Yes. That's
So
very, very Zen of you, James.
yeah, yeah, I think so. Then
Okay.
let's
Right.
look at her
So
taxation. So yes, so she reduces income tax. Obviously, that is to free up more money for the average working person, but you're going to have to cut spending for that. Cuts capital gains tax and inheritance tax. Now that's traditional Tory playbooks because that's going to benefit mostly the richer voters. Though she does actively target trying to peel off working class voters into the Conservative Party, and there are Thatcherite working class voters today, that came from that position. Um,
yeah.
so her VAT increase, as you said, pushes up prices of goods. So that causes problems for poorer people. They won't be able to pay for it. Her taxation policy led to a decline in manufacturing production, which I think that manufacturing in the UK had been declining since World War II anyway. We never managed to keep a fully functioning manufacturing industry.
That's because she refuses to support industries that are making losses.
Yeah, yeah. And we'll talk about that with privatization.
Yeah,
I mean, these kind of overlap a little bit as well, but yeah,
yeah.
he refused to. And I, that
So basically, as a government, you can make a decision if there's a declining industry, it's
yeah,
making a deficit. You can pump money into it to kind of prop it up so
yeah.
that you don't lose jobs, right?
Yeah, or
Um,
now in the because the danger was this was a fully globalizing market, so you wouldn't need to. But now there's this national security interests in holding on to
yeah,
companies that there wouldn't people wouldn't have thought of in the 80s. But now it's looking like if you don't have, you might need to subsidize some industries to hold on to that strategic advantage. I mean, look at China. They subsidize some, and that's allowed them to protect themselves from American economic buffers in a way other countries can't. When Trump goes,
it's true, but on the other hand, it leads to very perverse outcomes, doesn't it?
it does, but that's only if you expect the global economy to be fair, free, open, and functioning, which it's not clear that it will be right now.
Yeah,
I think,
yeah,
and that's the danger. Like everyone just assumed the world was going to move into a more free and more open way, and
yeah,
that looks very, very naive now.
yeah. Well,
Uh,
I think one difference today is that we have rather than just goods, I mean, we have intellectual property. We
yeah,
have AI and social media, all that sort of stuff. It implies a different kind of economics, I think,
yeah,
on the international level.
I don't want to go
But
off too much, but
anyway, I don't know, we're going too much for it.
AI
But it's interesting.
combined.
So let's go back. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay. All
unemployment
right.
went up, which is needed in monetarism. That's the thing, and that's where Heath did his U-turn. When unemployment went up, when he started implementing these policies,
Yeah.
he U-turned on it. Was
That's
Thatcher was willing to stay with it.
yeah. Because
Um,
unemployment looks bad, doesn't it? Like
yeah, it does.
when the papers report higher unemployment, everyone gets the feeling that things are really not going well. So there's a strong temptation. It's very understandable why
Yeah,
Heath Heath did his U-turn, correct?
yeah, yeah. And
Nice.
obviously the unemployment's not evenly distributed in the country under Thatcher either. That's why she's loved in certain parts of the country and hated in others. Like unemployment
Yeah.
in the southeast in London is really low, but in the mining towns, and basically where she fails and where Blair picks up afterwards is when people lost their jobs under Thatcher, she didn't retrain them or give them any kind of ability to train into something else.
Right.
Whereas Blair kind of kept the macroeconomic policies of Thatcher, but you know, aimed to help those who lose out from it. Does that make sense? And I think
Yeah.
that's where it was like a more Blair's version of Thatcherism is like a more humane Thatcherism. Again, it's normal. You look at what works from the previous government, previous systems, and why would you change that? And then you look at where it's not working and you fix it. I think Britain's always been a kind of like pragmatic, little by little country as opposed to really ideologically driven. So
Right.
that tends to become there. Obviously, then exports become dearer as well, which is a big problem because British exports are already a bit expensive and not very good in comparison at this point to like Germany and that. So we can't really compete on the export market, which is going to lead to other possibilities of again like balance of trade deficit. And all our policies are more costly for people with debt because interest payments go up.
Interest rate.
Yeah, which is where
The
she
interest
was,
rate
which
is
she
fine.
thought debtor, like working class people with debt were not as useful effectively for the economy. So she really valued saving, thriftiness. I think it's from her
Yes.
own background because she comes from a more working class background and then she was grammar school educated, went through stuff as well. One of my favorite facts about her, did you know she was part of the team of chemists that invented Mr. Whippy ice cream?
No way. Really?
Yeah, that's it.
I love Mr. Whippy. That's a huge achievement.
Yeah, yeah, it is. But also quite funny because she was a chemist. I just love the
Really?
fact that when I found that out,
I,
I love the fact that Margaret Thatcher invented Mr. Whippy ice cream.
well, that's fantastic. I'm going to use that as a dinner table
Yeah.
fact.
Well, did you know also that
Uh,
like her one on Thatcher milk snatcher when she was accused of taking milk away from the students, she was actually opposed to that policy and she fought against it, but because of collective cabinet responsibility, she had to own it. So a lot of the things that are most famous about her like are not really true, which is interesting.
yeah.
We had
Right.
Lord Lilly come in. So in the economic policy in general, so she successfully challenged the Keynesian post-war consensus in a way that Heath didn't. So like I would say like when people say like was it an economic revolution under Thatcher, I would say ideologically no. but in execution, yes, because he had thought about it, tried to do it, failed. So it wasn't any. It had been intent. It had been an attempt to
Yeah,
implement it previously,
yeah,
but she was the
yeah.
one who executed it. So I think that's why she gets credit. But is it a revolution? I don't know. That's where it'd be harder. So obviously under this, weaker businesses struggle, stronger ones thrive. So it's kind of like introducing survival of the fittest into the economic system, which is really strong. And Big Bang in the city freed up financial firms. So she brought that in between 83 and 87. And she basically allowed like people to buy shares into the stock market, which liberalized that. Before you had to have special brokers to buy stuff. She allowed ordinary people to buy shares, which again meant people with savings from the working class could buy shares, start doing things that the middle class, certainly the richer and the middle class have been able to do for ages. And also like the ability to buy their own council houses. So there was that aspirational move up. But the problem with this is it led to like riots in Liverpool and Brixton. So like poorer areas of the country really fell here. And if you're going to close down all these industries, it's going to impact areas where these industries are. So the macro economy benefits everyone, but the impacts in the localized economies is unevenly spread and hits a
Yeah.
lot of places harder than others. Another argument you can make is she got lucky because North Sea oil prices went up in this period. So, that was in the boom period for North Sea oil for Britain. So it could just be beneficial rather than her policies doing it. Um, the gaps between richer and poorer parts of the country widened in this period. So this is where like the southeast and London really accelerated to be much richer than the rest of the country. Um, some people argue her deregulation of the city encouraged a selfish get rich mentality, which is again that the whole idea of the 80s, the yuppies, that argument both in America and in that breaking of the post-war consensus was kind of a solidarity that's then seemed to be split by her. And like the social costs of destroying families and unemployment, especially in deprived areas, outweigh the benefits. So there's still a legacy today that in a lot of these post-industrial parts of the UK, it's just dire. The economic situation hasn't really, and they're like basically a lot of the Brexit voting parts of the country as well. So they got hit
Did
really
she?
hard.
Right. Did she kind of come up with these kind of what do you call them? Kind of housing project?
Housing projects, you mean
There
like
was,
council estates?
yeah.
No, they were there for a long time.
Ah,
She was the one who allowed them to buy it. So the council
right,
estates they were part of the post-war consensus building council estates up for working class and poor people. They're split in between areas in England, so it's kind of mixed up. So they don't ghettoize them in the way they do in like France or America,
right.
which is quite nice. So there's a lot more mixing. There's a lot more understood. But no, she allowed them to buy their way out of them. And then, of course, privatization was the last one. So she doesn't accelerate the privatization process till after the 1983 election, and that's because she needed that first term. It's after 83 that she gets rid of the wets. So she gets rid of the post-war consensus conservatives
Yeah.
in her government, pretty much all of them, which means she can then really accelerate through after her second election victory in pursuing the policy of dismantling the post-war consensus. Um, Obviously, privatization proved really popular with people who bought the shares because they made a lot of money off this. That's why I said my uncle made lots of money off buying shares in these companies.
That's
Yeah.
quite a clever it's quite a clever strategy, isn't it? Of
Yeah.
making those shares available at the same time as you privatize.
Yes. Well, you'd have to, I suppose, because someone's got to buy into it. But at least they didn't hand it over to like Russia to like just oligarchs. They just hand it over to oligarchy. They actually allowed ordinary workers to buy into these companies, which meant a lot of them could buy into companies they worked for as well. So they have a vested interest in the success of that company as well.
Mhm.
In the same way, like, what the old conservative mantra, if you don't own your house, you don't have a vested interest in the country. That was why they didn't want people to vote. They didn't own land or property. And the same way
Yeah,
with companies, I guess you have a vested interest in the success of your company if you own part of it.
yeah,
This allowed thrifty middle class people to make economic gains, and it lowered prices, improved performance, and offered consumers more choice. This is because obviously the inefficient companies die off. Because the problem before with bailing out these companies and what Heath did with Rolls-Royce and that as well as you've got companies that are failing. So they're losing money. So the government has to give them money to survive. And they're obviously taking that money from efficient, productive parts of the economy that are paying those taxes and transferring it to inefficient parts of the economy. So, what is the incentive for those companies to modernize or to be more efficient if they're just going to be bailed out anyway. Reason isn't.
Yeah.
And it's like you're just creating a negative doom spiral by taking money from productive parts of the economy to non-productive ones. So that's the positive argument is then it will be more efficient. Like you said, privatize companies. If you've got competition, you have to run your company more efficiently. Um, I don't think it works for every industry because you can't really, we've got privatized railways, they're disaster because you can't really have competition on one railway track. So like some industries do, like ones that worked really well in the UK was like mobile phones. For example,
Mhm.
phone privatizations made mobile phone company contracts much, much cheaper. So I think some have worked, some haven't. You need kind of an oversight on them though, because otherwise they just really can just run purely for profit. And that was one of the two of the negatives. Like privatized industries run for the profits of shareholders and not the interest of customers. So when you've got services or companies that are vitally important for the economy or the or people in general, do you really want it in the hands of someone who's just running it for profit? But when you've got companies that mostly run just for profit, it's not really a problem. And there was a group undervaluing of the companies, which meant they were sold for less than their value, and often to contacts in the Conservative Party. So that equally looks a bit suspect. And the other problem is like obviously that creates a massive economic boom for the government because they're selling all these companies, they're making lots of money, but eventually you run out of things to sell. So the economy starts flagging by the end of Thatcher's like terms in office. Is that because her economic policies really work, or did they just make lots of money from selling off all the country's assets and make money off the North Sea oil? And that's the key distinction about whether it was successful or not. Certainly was
Yeah.
interesting. And also like those industries that were failing, the people who lost their jobs in those towns, those cities, what were they able to do afterwards?
Yeah.
So I think her economic policies are quite controversial, but overall, would you say they were successful or not?
I would argue, I think I would argue overall, yes, but I would qualify it.
Go on.
I think I'd argue it is. I think on some of the big questions, for example, inflation,
Yeah,
um, privatization, and the giving incentives, I guess, to middle class families to
yeah,
save and to invest in shares.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I think those are pretty strong points in favour of Thatcher's economic policy. I think though, on the other hand, there are qualifications,
yeah,
which you mentioned. Um, you can argue, yeah, partly luck with the oil prices, and certainly costs.
mm.
So, such unemployment,
Yeah. And I think if you're a minor in
certain sections, right? Loss of, yeah, if you're a minor. Sorry, James, you're saying,
Yeah, I was going to say if you're a minor, you're going to lose out. I would say macroeconomically, it obviously worked for the country, like whether she
yeah,
get full credit for or not. But macro, I mean, Britain was known as the sick man of Europe before 1979, before Thatcher came in. You can't argue that the country wasn't in a better position macroeconomically at the end of Thatcher's term than it was at the beginning. I mean,
yeah, you can just argue how much credit does she get,
yeah, but look at the
if any?
70s. I mean, it's
So,
clearly the country's overall is in a better place, but it's just specific pockets of the country really suffer.
yeah,
I'd say it's probably like 80-20, maybe 80% of the population benefits most. It's like usually in these kind of free market economic situations, 20% down. And it's like, what do you do with that 20% is the key difference. I suppose the biggest reason why you can say our economic policies were successful is we still currently in Britain live in the Thatcherite economic system. If it hadn't been successful, there's no way Blair would have accepted most of Thatcherite's economic policies. Labour hasn't gone back to the post-war consensus, no government has. So I
yeah,
suppose, like, if you're going to think about what success of economic policy, if the subsequent governments that follow you continue to follow your economic policies, that would suggest they are at least somewhat effective.
I would agree.
Like I said, I think Blair keeps all of the major points of Thatcherite economics, just deals with where it doesn't work. And as we've
Yeah,
said, those who lose out, and obviously, like, there's a slight push now to nationalize some industries again, especially railways, like ones that aren't working under privatization. There are some that are. I mean, why would you need to touch them? I think the problem is it's like the dogma. It's the same dogma of privatize everything is the same problem with nationalize everything. There's probably
Yes,
a
yeah.
degree of balance in there, and it's certain industries need one and certain need the other.
Absolutely.
You've got to
Oh
look where
yeah,
it
I think so.
works. Like if it works for privatization, keep it. If it works for nationalization, keep it. Like, you know what I mean? If it's not working, try the other. Like, so it should be just a simple thing that you know if something's working or not. And I think that basically the biggest impact is that the country is still living in a Thatcherite economic consensus. The post-war consensus was blown apart, and no one's decided to challenge it yet.
Yeah.
Even Starmer's not. No one's challenging it. Maybe Corbyn. So like, put it this way: every time Labour has advocated for going back to a post-war consensus under Foot or under Corbyn, they've been
They
smashed
fail. Yeah. Yeah.
in elections. So that would suggest that the country has no appetite for it either. And it's definitely a
Uh,
better country macroeconomically now than it was in the 70s. Post-war
yeah.
consensus. There's an argument now that Thatcher economics isn't really working. We need it another way, but it hasn't. No one's come up with one yet. And then, so
Okay.
looking at economic, and of course, you can just put a general, if you get one on how successful was she in general, you can just put one paragraph on economics and kind of compile down the main points of those arguments. So we can look at her social policies. So her biggest three social policies with how she dealt with the NHS, how she dealt with education, how she dealt with council houses. So I'll start with the NHS. So she decided that she wanted to make the NHS more efficient by applying business principles. This is the idea of her kind of bringing in the same principles behind the drive for privatization into the NHS itself. So, and hospitals could become self-governing, controlling their own budget. And the idea behind that being that they would not need to be regulated from outside. And ironically, Starmer's just removed NHS England, so there's kind of a consensus on that now as well. NHS services were to compete with each other to kind of again lead to efficiencies and better hospitals, better doctor systems, GPs to get control of their own funds, so that the idea of this breaking it down to local level, which is obviously like small c conservative general idea that most people know how to run their own systems better than an overarching macro policy, which has some credit. And supporters of it argued that it injected financial discipline into the NHS because the healthcare costs were insane. Like even Rab Butler back in the 50s had said, my God, if this continues like this, we won't be able to afford it. And currently the UK has big problems with affording it.
Yeah.
Critics argue it was the first stage in privatizing the NHS, which is a big problem because again, that there still is no appetite in the UK to break the welfare state. The fourth plank of the post-war consensus is still there.
I think
Um,
that's true everywhere. It's true in the US too.
I don't think the US has any any social security in the comparison. I think the US is kind of like you're on your own comparatively to Europe. It's not even on the same planet. As a European, I wouldn't. I look at the US and I don't think they have a social welfare system, not a proper one. It's
We've got a
dysfunctional.
massive one that's very expensive.
It's costing lots of
But
money and delivering
so,
nothing. It's like the worst of both
so
worlds. Yeah.
but
Yeah, but I don't think they have a
anyway,
real social
so
security system. I just think they're pumping loads of money into God knows what. People were worried the profit would be put ahead of social care, which is a problem obviously in the NHS because that's not its main driving force. There are certain industries that shouldn't be run for profit, and people I think are a little nervous about doctors and hospitals being run for profit. And people argue that business methods were inappropriate for public services. Other problems with this is like, are doctors really able to manage their own budgets? They're not accountants. They're able to control that. Are hospitals going to become really good at self-governing? You have to think it's like, yeah, this works in business because business people are trained for those that's their bread and butter.
mm,
But like, I don't think doctors' main bread and butter is how to run a business. It's not their primary focal point. So would they actually be able to do this? And I think, any thoughts on her NHS reforms?
uh no, nothing more than that. I think you've covered basically
Yeah, so it
what
depends
I
again on
looked
which,
at.
yeah, which side of the ideological divide you're going to be on as whether this is successful or not. It's still a problem, the NHS.
So
They're still looking at reforming it. They still can't work out how exactly they want to do it.
what would you say? Do you think it's a success or a failure, James?
I would say it was a failure because it's still unaddressed now. So I would say she doesn't really address it, and she touches on a very sensitive issue that I think the public wasn't really willing to deal with. In that time period. I think her other two social policies are more successful. We'll deal with council houses because I think education is where we're going to get into an interesting debate. Um, So in council houses, she obviously allowed people to buy their council houses. As I said, my aunt managed to do that. So council tenants could buy their own homes, which was the idea of them being the whole conservative principle is the idea that if you own your home, you own the land, you have a vested interest in the country and its
Mhm.
success. So that's always been the long principle behind conservativeness in general. And the whole principle in the UK behind originally you couldn't vote if you didn't own land for that same purpose. She wanted those who she saw as hardworking, self-reliant, and took the initiative to be able to buy their own homes. That fits into her policy in general of social mobility and aspirational working class, which I think is her main driving force. And I think that's because she herself was an aspirational member of the working class. She got to be prime minister from a more humble background than a lot of other previous prime ministers, especially in the Conservative Party. And she believed owning homes made them less likely to be socialist, which is true. Like there's a clear marker that the people go up the economic ladder, the more likely they are to vote on the right,
It is. It
like what
is.
they
It's
have. I mean, we
yeah.
have a different
So
one because the Liberal Democrats, I think, if you've got money and a social conscience, you vote Liberal Democrat in the UK. So they exist for that purpose. The Lib Dem voters are mostly people who are financially pretty well off, but don't like a lot of what the Conservatives do, especially on social issues. I think in general this is quite successful, but in the short term at least, but in the long term, the problem is it means the stock of council houses dropped and was never fully replenished. There was no real big house. If you're looking at this, there's no real big housing building project like there was, and
so what does that
Millen
what
doing
does
it
that
under Churchill.
yeah. Does that mean that if you need a house, if you're eligible, you just
Yeah,
have to go in a long waiting list,
yeah,
or how does that
huge,
work?
huge waiting list for council houses now. Incredibly difficult to get onto it. Yeah, stockpiles,
Really?
especially in places especially in places where people had the money to buy them. So London and that, so it's unevenly distributed. The problem with Thatcher is that her policies skewed the country. You know what I mean? So there's no real universality in the position of the country at the moment.
Hmm. Okay.
So I
That's
would
something
say
that the
again, it's going to be successful in the short term and certainly successful for those aspirational working class people who want to own and buy their properties. That's beneficial to them. But I would say the long-term damage to the council housing stockpile is a bit of a problem. So none of
okay.
I think the key with Thatcher is probably more people benefit than they don't, but the people who don't benefit really get hit hard in her policies, if that makes sense. I think that's probably put it. And then education, obviously, massively more. She was a huge believer in education, grammar school kid herself. So she obviously saw the opportunities that education had to lift yourself out. And I obviously as a grammar school kid myself, I also believed in that that came from my mum was a council estate kid, and I've gone on to go to UCL and do really good things based on the back of the education opportunities that I probably wouldn't have had without Thatcher. So I'm probably slightly biased in this one. So like I'll do the successes and failures and we can debate it. So she introduced the introduction of a national curriculum to create standardization of education throughout the country and GCSEs to improve the standard of education in Britain. So before GCSEs, there were CSEs and O levels. And so like bright kids were allowed to take O levels and like less bright kids had to do CSEs. So you were kind of segregated on your educational opportunity. And so a lot of kids wouldn't have had the opportunity to go to university or study into the higher qualifications, so they weren't allowed to take them. It's a bit like the gymnasium system in Germany, I believe. So, like the fact that now she created a universal GCSE means every kid has the opportunity to go to university if they're good enough, and there's no that segregation anymore. Which get again that whole point of aspirational working class kids who want to be able to get out of their situation. Um, State schools could become grant maintained and control their own budgets. Again, similar to the NHS, that just the whole idea of local funding, local ability to control stuff. Good if you can run it effectively. So, of course, the problem with this is that some schools will run that really well and some won't.
Yeah. Yeah.
But despite these attacks, she kept grants for university students. It wasn't the fees weren't brought in until under Blair, I believe. So it was a Labour government that brought in fees for university. She kept grants for university places and also kept maintained polytechnics for vocational training, so didn't destroy it as another route. So she opens up the possibility you can go in multiple different routes, and she kept the university free, which you'd expect, from would be something you wouldn't necessarily associate with Thatcher, I think.
Although she does cut the budget, doesn't she?
Yeah, she does. University budgets were cut, but they're looking for funding from other sources. That probably leads to the increase in international students and stuff as well. But yeah, but again, that's about that drive of efficiency. Do you need that much money to do it? So
Well,
there was,
what? Okay. Yeah.
yeah. So we'll get, yeah. So
We'll get it. Yeah.
yeah, there were concerns that GCSEs were not academically rigorous enough, although I think that's because it's the mix of the two qualifications, but I don't think that really matters too much because Jesus, it's the A levels that are going to determine if you go to university.
Because you would say that if you're an O-level student, wouldn't you?
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
if you're
Well,
an O-level
obviously.
student and then now you're doing
Yeah, but
GCSE, presumably it's
no,
not quite as hard.
I think the middle class don't want poor kids to challenge their kids for top university places. So they want to keep them locked out of those opportunities.
No,
Because they don't
well,
generally don't generally want competition in education. They want competition in their own benefits. That would be my argument. They said content's too restrictive and testing's too frequent. There were disagreements on the content for history and English, particularly. History's always had a weird one because the Conservative Party is really in favor of keeping history as a subject, but they want it taught in a certain way.
yeah,
Positivity
sounds
of British
familiar.
history,
Yeah.
whereas Labour give you more freedom, but then they don't value it as a subject. So you got a problem as a history teacher. This is where it comes into fact. I mean, the fact that this course is designed under a Conservative government and starts in 51 after Attlee and ends in 97 before Blair, it's noticeable. So inconsistency of freedom of budget, but not content. I think that's not. I don't know. Content in history is all right. Like as a head of department, if I had a key stage three, my only requirement in key stage three is I must teach 1066 to the modern times, and I must teach the Holocaust. I have no other restrictions. So if I want to teach just Japanese feudal shogun history, I can with a bit of the Holocaust. So it's like, so really, I think there's total freedom, but I think some subjects have more freedom than others. History is definitely one where there's a lot of freedom. I would
Yeah.
say it's a success to her policies because it opened up education to the working class and really in the designs of aspirational. And as someone who massively benefited from these reforms, I'm going
But
to be in favor. Yeah.
that's a little, I mean, from an outsider's perspective, if you
Yeah.
don't know a lot about Thatcher, that's
Yeah.
quite unexpected.
Yeah.
Um, that you wouldn't necessarily expect that, would you? Because
Well,
if you're sort of, if I mean, just at first glance, you would
yeah.
assume, given that she's on the right
Yeah.
and very, rather libertarian in her
Yeah.
economic social outlook, that that she wouldn't necessarily benefit the poorer students,
Well,
say in education, but
I think you can argue yes, because if working class people get a really good education and they go to university and they earn lots of money, who are they going to vote for? So,
okay, yeah,
so
yeah,
you're eliminating the Labour Party's voting base.
yeah, clever strategy.
All of these things, if you're looking at council house buying, owning of shares, meritocracy in education, all these, I mean, they're all good for the country in general, but they're certainly good for eliminating Labour voters.
Right.
And and because you're not going to peel off all of the Labour voters, but you will peel off if Labour's saying, no, you can't make, what I mean, if Labour's killing these aspirations, people don't want to stay permanently working class in general.
Well, and so, James, what do you make of this shocking fact that Oxford, the great University of Oxford, refused to grant Thatcher an honorary degree?
Didn't she already have one from there, though? Does she need an honorary
No,
degree?
I don't think so.
Oh,
I think they usually grant one.
yeah,
They
but
were very happy.
he has a real one. Uh, didn't she do chemistry at Oxford? I think it was she did chemistry at one of them. I think it was Oxford, hmm? Yeah. So she studied, she's got a real degree in Oxford. Why does she need an honorary one?
I
I
thought I'd
would want an
ambush you with
honorary degree if I
that.
got a real one from Oxford. I've got a real one. Thank you very much. I don't need this pathetic paper thing. No. She used it to make Mr. Whippy.
That's right.
What more do you need? She used her degree to make Mr. Whippy. I would say, just very quickly, I would say socially, she was actually pretty successful. Ironically,
Okay.
I would
Yeah.
say, ironically, for a right-wing prime minister, her social policies were more obviously effective than her economic ones, which are more debatable.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Cool.